Welcome to the deep dive. You've shared some really interesting material with us, all focused on U.S. immigration policy.
Yeah, naturally.
And our goal today really is to try and cut through some of the noise, understand the big shifts, and, the ongoing debates about how immigration is enforced and actual policies behind it all.
That's right. And the information you sent, it covers, well, quite a range. Everything from border security, asylum processes, visas, even these newer programs trying to incentivize self-deportation. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. Okay, so let's start unpacking. One of the things that really jumped out from what you said was this idea from DHS about offering a $1,000 stipend to migrants if they choose to leave the U.S. voluntarily.
Yes, that one's definitely stirred up a lot of conversation. It's interesting because it's being framed partly as an enforcement tool,
Yeah.
a way to manage migration flows. And we've also seen the administration pointing to other figures, like a reported drop in border arrests in March, a record low apparently, alongside an increase in ICE detentions inside the country.
ICE being Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Exactly. They're using those stats to suggest their overall enforcement approach is, well, effective.
Right, but I mean, the perspectives on this stipend idea are starkly different, aren't they? You've got, for example, Democratic Congressman Adriano Espaillat saying very clearly, we don't bribe people to leave. We build a country where everyone belongs.
That really gets to the heart of the philosophical divide, doesn't it? About what immigration policy should be.
Yeah.
And then you look at immigration advocates like Esther Reyes from the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition. Their take is quite different. They argue this kind of offer doesn't touch the root, causes the violence, the poverty, the persecution that forces people to leave their homes in the first place.
So they see it as potentially exploitative.
That's the argument, yes. That it could prey on people's fear and vulnerability rather than offering real solutions.
And you can see how that would create anxiety, especially for what they call mixed status families. The material mentions some families are even making contingency plans, like getting U.S. passports for their kids born here.
Exactly. That really highlights the human element, the uncertainty these policies can create for people on the ground. It's one thing to talk about statistics, border arrests, detentions.
Right.
But the day-to-day reality for families navigating this system is, well, it's incredibly complex and often very stressful.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. The material you shared also included a report looking back over a specific 4-year period, calling it a time of profound change in immigration policy. That title alone tells you something significant happened.
Absolutely. And what's really striking about that report isn't just the big headline-grabbing policies. It's the sheer volume of changes, big and small, and the strategic way they were rolled out.
How so? Strategic?
Well, it wasn't just one or two major laws. It was a constant flow of adjustments through regulations, new policies, memos, program changes, layered on top of each other.
Okay, layered, that's interesting. The report used the public charge regulation as a key example. Can you walk us through what that involved and why that layering was so important?
Sure. So the basic idea behind the public charge rule was to make it harder for immigrants who might, potentially use public benefits to get green cards, legal permanent residency.
Okay.
But it wasn't just one rule from, say, USCIS, that's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Yeah. They started with that in 2019, but then came related State Department guidance, a separate State Department regulation, changes to fee waivers, a presidential memo about sponsor finances, another proclamation on health insurance, even a Social Security rule about English proficiency, and a proposed rule from Housing and Urban Development, HUD, about subsidized housing. It was a whole suite of actions aimed at the same goal.
So the thinking was if one piece got challenged in court, maybe others would stick. Is that the strategy?
That seems to be the logic, yeah. Build redundancy into the policy structure, make it harder to dismantle through litigation. And the report points out that the sheer speed and number of these changes also made it incredibly tough for advocacy groups and lawyers to even track everything, let alone challenge it all effectively.
It sounds exhausting just trying to keep up. And the report also stresses that some changes looked small, maybe technical, but added up to have a really big impact, things that might not make the news.
That's a crucial point. In 2018, the State Department quietly changed its internal guidance, the consular manual, giving visa officers more discretion to shorten the validity period for non-immigrant visas. Think tourists, students, temporary workers.
Okay, so instead of maybe getting a visa valid for several years.
Right, maybe the maximum allowed, sometimes 10 years. Suddenly, officers had more leeway to issue them for shorter periods. This meant more frequent renewals, more vetting, more chances to apply new rules. a seemingly small tweak with potentially big consequences for a lot of people.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Because during this period, there was so much rhetoric, so much focus on enforcement, right? At the border, inside the country.
Definitely.
Yet the report highlights that fiscal year 2019 actually saw the highest number of migrant apprehensions at the southwest border since, 2007? That seems like a disconnect.
It does on the surface. The administration's response, as described in the report, was to create this policy regime at the border. This wasn't just about physical barriers. It included things like the rule making people ineligible for asylum if they hadn't applied in a country they passed through first.
The transit ban.
Exactly. And the asylum cooperative agreements, those deals with some Central American countries to send asylum seekers there.
Yeah.
And of course the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP.
Commonly known as Remain in Mexico.
That's the one, sending asylum seekers back to Mexico to wait for their U.S. court dates.
So the goal of all these policies together was essentially to limit access to the U.S. asylum system itself.
That appears to be the primary aim, yes. And the report does suggest that this combination did eventually lead to fewer people arriving at the border seeking asylum.
Okay, what about inside the U.S. interior enforcement? That was also a major focus, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The report details quite a few efforts there. Things like trying to stretch the interpretation of laws against harboring undocumented immigrants to pressure so-called sanctuary jurisdictions by threatening to withhold federal funds.
Right, jurisdictions limiting cooperation with ICE.
Precisely. There's also a clear push for ICE to use less prosecutorial discretion, basically, to target a broader group for removal and for federal prosecutors to pursue more cases of illegal entry.
But it sounds like not everyone was on board with this. There's pushback from states and cities.
Definitely. You had states like New York limiting access to their DMV databases for immigration enforcement, Washington state putting restrictions on local police cooperating. Clear acts of resistance.
And the federal response
was often to increase targeted enforcement operations, like ICE raids, in those specific communities. But the report notes that this lack of cooperation did have an impact. It hampered interior enforcement efforts, and the overall numbers for arrests and removals didn't actually hit the levels seen in some prior years.
It really shows that tension between federal goals and state or local autonomy in immigration, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And, the report even mentions different groups counting the number of policy actions differently. Migration Policy Institute, MPI, had a lower number because they grouped some related small changes. It just shows how hard it is to quantify the sheer scale of activity.
Yeah, it makes getting a clear picture challenging for anyone, including you, the listener, trying to follow all this. The report also mentioned the pandemic. That must have thrown another huge wrench into everything.
Oh, completely. The pandemic brought travel bans, massive slowdowns, and changes in visa processing overseas, and a whole new set of border measures, often justified on public health grounds.
Like what specifically?
Well, you had the CBC requiring negative COVID tests for travelers from certain places, like the UK initially. ICE suspended visits at detention centers, changed check-in procedures. The immigration courts, EOIR and USCIS, had to adapt quickly, allowing things like email filings or digital signatures temporarily. Even premium processing for some visas got paused.
And at the border, it wasn't just MPP and the asylum agreements during this time, right? Other things were happening?
Correct. ICE ended its coordinated release program. There was continued detention of families and children, which was controversial. And of course, the push to build more barriers on the southern border continued, involving funding shifts, transferring public land,
Right.
plus other initiatives like deploying body cameras for Border Patrol, proposed fee changes for trusted traveler programs. A lot of activity.
It's just layers upon layers. And interior enforcement, beyond the sanctuary city issue, saw other changes too.
Yes. Things like new limits on stays of removal tied to private immigration bills in Congress, ending a program called the Family Case Management Program, expanding the use of expedited removal, which allows for quicker deportations without a full court hearing for some people.
I remember hearing about billboards.
Yeah, that was part of it too. Billboards displaying information about non-citizens released from criminal custody. Also, new rules for immigration bonds, ramping up the Secure Communities program again, using visa sanctions against countries slow to take back their nationals, like Burundi was mentioned. Directives to increase ICE officer numbers. Though the report notes the actual number of enforcement and removal operations officers didn't significantly increase. And as we said, the ongoing efforts to financially pressure sanctuary jurisdictions, though many faced legal challenges, plus increased worksite enforcement.
And the immigration courts themselves.
Yeah.
Changes there too.
significant ones. Changes to how immigration judges were hired, the zero-tolerance policy leading to more prosecutions for illegal entry, key decisions limiting asylum eligibility, particularly for victims of domestic violence or gang violence, through cases like Matter of AB.
Right. Those case names come up a lot.
They do. They set precedent. Also, more scrutiny from the Board of Immigration Appeals, the BIA, on asylum cases. Proposals to give judges contempt power, increasing fees for appeals, trying to reshape how the courts function.
It sounds like a really systematic effort across the board. What about refugees and asylum seekers specifically, beyond the border policies?
That was a major focus. Refugee admission ceilings were set at historic lows year after year.
Yeah.
Screening for refugees became stricter. We already mentioned the limits on asylum based on Matter of AB and the transit ban, but also changes to the credible fear screening process, new bars to asylum eligibility, a policy of processing asylum applications last in, first out, which affected wait times, and significant changes impacting unaccompanied children, how their status was assessed, access to services, stricter release policies, more scrutiny of sponsors, fingerprinting requirements, generally a more restrictive environment for humanitarian protection.
And programs like TPS, Temporary Protected Status, and DED?
Also saw a lot of action. Attempts to terminate TPS for people from several countries like El Salvador, Haiti, Sudan, Nicaragua, leading to ongoing lawsuits. DED for Liberians was initially ended, then extended, and eventually Congress provided a path to green cards, and rules making it harder for some TPS recipients with permission to travel abroad, called advanced parole, to later apply for permanent residency.
Even the State Department, beyond just processing visas, was actively involved in other ways.
Oh, definitely. Implementing the various travel bans, the slowdown in visa interviews we mentioned, collecting more data like social media info from applicants, the heightened public charge vetting, shortening visa validity periods.
Right, we talked about that.
Also, applying stricter standards for non-immigrant intent, especially for certain business visas, imposing visa restrictions on individuals accused of undermining democracy in places like Guyana or Sudan, or involved in corruption in Uganda. The State Department was a key player.
And finally, USCIS, the agency handling benefits like green cards and citizenship, more changes there.
A whole raft of them. Fewer requests for evidence or notices of intent to deny were issued, which might sound good, but there was an increase in notices to appear, which start deportation cases. Stricter standards for naturalization, changing terminology like using alien instead of foreign national, raising fee waiver standards, expanding the list of acts that could bar citizenship.
It sounds like making the process harder overall.
That was the effect of many changes, yes. The public charge rule implementation, clarifications on residency for naturalization, increased fees generally, a policy on inadmissibility for members of totalitarian parties, changes to appeals, changes to waivers for unlawful presence.
And DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Huge battles there. Attempts to rescind the program, court challenges back and forth, reopening old removal cases for DACA recipients. Also, efforts to enforce financial support agreements made by sponsors, major shifts in the H-1B visa program for skilled workers, wage rules, site visits, a new registration system, suspending